Welcome back to this session. Let us try to understand a little more about variables that are used in functions. So please type this code. Now you will notice that when you call change 1, it will print the value 10, and you will notice that if you do print q, you will actually get a name error. Why? What is going on? This q variable is completely local to this function, which means just because you created q inside this function, it does not exist outside of this function. So this q, Python does not know what q is outside of this function. Inside of this function it's perfectly fine, but outside it does not know what it is, alright, which means any arguments you pass to Python functions, those arguments are completely local. So which means if I had a q here and I had a q in the function, those two q's will be actually very different, alright. If you change the q inside the function, it does not mean you are going to change the value outside, it does not always mean this, alright. So arguments passed to Python are local. Now variables also inside a function, suppose you create a new variable inside a function, that is also local. Please try this code. So in this case n is 5, which is outside, but n is also defined inside this function as 10. So now when you print this, try and see what happens to your So notice that when you call change, it prints 10, which means even though n is 5 outside, n inside this is 10. That is not so surprising, but the next line is surprising perhaps for some of you, because when you say print 10, you may think it should have been 10. No. Remember that this n is completely local to this function, so it does not change the outside n. This n, so you will basically get print, you will get 10, and then the next print will be 5, alright. Again this shows you that variables inside a function are local, and this also shows you how you can yourself learn how the Python interpreter works by trying your own code and seeing what happens, okay. Just few lines of code you can actually find out, oh, Python is doing this, Python is doing that. So it's a good way for you to learn Python by yourselves. So let's move on. Now supposing, so try this code. Again the name of this function in this case is just some dummy name, it could have been any function, the scope has no particular meaning. Notice that if you printed, then you did this, it's not an error. Why? Because supposing this n is not defined in this function, what Python will do is it will look outside this function, above it, and see, oh, there is already an n. Supposing you did not have this n defined in your interpreter at all, then you would get a name error. So essentially if the function is not defined, it looks in the parent scope. So a scope basically defines the region in which your variables are defined and are available. So in this case the scope here for this n is inside this function. On the other hand, the scope of this n is in this entire session in this case. So here when you do n is 5, inside the function scope n is not available, so Python says, oh, I don't find it here, it goes to the parent, which is this scope, and says, ah, n is available, prints the value, alright. Note that n was not defined inside scope, and it looked for the variable in previous scope, which is here. If you want to explore this a little better, you may want to check out this very nice online tool called pythontutor.com. Over there you can type your code, it will show you how the code executes, it will also show you what the scopes are, what are the variables, what are the values of the variables. It's kind of like an online visualizer for your Python code. So if you are struggling to understand concepts in Python, you might want to try typing your code there and looking at how it looks, right. We won't spend time here in this, but later on if you are interested, you might want to take a look at pythontutor.com. Let us move on to the next important concept. Now sometimes you may want to assign a value outside the scope of a function. This is usually not a good idea, but sometimes you need to do it. In this case, you can use the global statement to assign to global variables. So please try this code. Once you type out the change, call the change function and then print n and see what you get. Notice that the value will be 10, even though in the past you may have defined n to be 5. Your previous definition of n was 5, so it still exists in the global namespace. But since you set this global n here, when you do this assignment, it will actually assign it in this global namespace. Okay, so global variables you can always set using the global statement. Alright, so let us move on. Sometimes you have mutable variables, right? So please try this example. I hope you have typed this. Notice what happens. So when you do this, name is Mr. Steve Gosling, all three are separate elements of a list. So that this list has three elements, Mr. Steve Gosling. Now when you do change name, what is happening? So let us try and understand this code. Name is not defined inside this function, but it is defined outside. So that's fine. Now we are saying name of 0 is dr. So what happens? This element is now going to be changed from Mr. to Doctor. So when you call change name, if you print name, name will change because it is a mutable variable. Alright. Is this clear? So basically, because name is mutable, you can change the value of any of these items by simply assigning the value. And when you call the function, it will change this name. Unlike the case of immutable variables, the variable is mutable, a function can actually change it even if it is not inside the function's scope. Let us move on to another example. Please try this. So this behavior should be not surprising at all to you. N is 5, we say change n, n is 10, print n inside change. So now when we call change n, what has happened? You have passed the value 5, but then you set this n to 10, and then you printed n inside change and you get 10 inside change. But when you print n itself, because you have not made this global, it will only print the value 5. So this should not be surprising based on everything you have seen so far. Alright. Okay, so this example is very similar to the previous one. There is just some slight subtle changes. So we are saying name is Mr. Steve Gosling in this case. Def change name, notice the name of the argument. The name of the argument is x in this case, it is not name. Then we say x of 0 is doctor. Print x in change. So now when you call this, what are we doing? We are passing this list Mr. Steve Gosling to the change name function. So now what do you expect to happen in this case? Because you have set x of 0 is doctor, it will change this list and it should print that. So you should get Dr. Steve Gosling in change is what you will see. But the thing is, when you print name also, you will get Dr. Steve Gosling. So the reason this happens is mutable data types in Python are passed by reference, which means when you pass this name here, it does not make a copy of it. It passes the same list. Therefore, you will get the same Dr. Steve Gosling in both cases. I hope this is clear. Once again, even though the name here used is x and the name here used is name, when you pass name, this list into this, because this data type is mutable, it is passed by reference. So when you do x of 0 is dr, it actually changes this list. So when you pass arguments, you have to be careful. This is unlike the case where here it's an immutable type. When you do n is 10, n is now 10, but outside it's still 5. Whereas here name is a list, so you can actually change the elements of that list inside this function, even though you called it something entirely different. Now please try this example. Notice that in this case, when you said change name x, now that you have set x is equal to 1, 2, 3, you have actually created a new list called xs123, you will not be changing name. The reason is you have actually set a new variable x here which is only local to this function, and you are simply printing 123 in this case. The name will not be changed in this case. This should not really be very surprising if you have followed Python so far. But if not, please take a note of what is happening. When you create this name, it's a list. Now when you call this change name, you pass this list. But what have you done here? You have simply created a new variable x called 123. It doesn't affect this x because that x is just a name for the same list. Now you are saying this name is now this new list 123. So when you do print x in change, all it does is it's printing this local variable here. Alright. Now let's look at the next example where the only change we have made is, instead of saying x is equal to 123, we are doing x slice, which means give me all the elements of x and replace them with 123. So please try this. You've just added from the previous example, all you have done is you have changed, you have added these 3 characters here. So you should be able to use up arrow and type this. Now if you print name, you will find that the name has also been changed to 123. Why is this? Because you have basically taken this x, which is name, and assigned the values 1, 2, 3 to every element. It is similar to what was done here, x of 0 is dr. When you do slice assignment, it changes the list in place. So which means when you pass a variable to a function, if that variable is mutable, you need to be a little careful. Alright. I hope you understand this. The best way to really understand this even better is to try these examples and think about what is happening inside. Thank you very much.